Greetings, Visionary. It's been a while, and I thought before wrapping up this season, it's time to record a quick, unscripted, probably slightly messy season finale for season 1 of the League of Visionaries podcast. In this episode, I want to acknowledge all the people who made this series possible, with a special shout out to the guests, the season sponsor, and of course, those all important people who make it all happen. You, the viewers and listeners. And then I'm also going to share a quick snapshot of exactly what happened and why I've left you on ice for a while, and why I'm sorry that I did it, but glad that I did after all. And then end up with a fantastic and exciting announcement about the next season of the League of Visionaries podcast. So let's jump into that intro for the last time in this season for the League of Visionaries podcast. See you on the other side. Welcome to the League of Visionaries podcast by YaziMedia. The League of Visionaries podcast is your place to meet visionaries, professionals, entrepreneurs, and other thought leaders with a visionary message to share. This podcast is for you if you too are a visionary, driven by a deeper purpose in your work, your play, and your investments. I'm your host, Marie-Therese Roux, the media strategist with soul and founder and owner of YaziMedia Virtual Media House. Connect with this League of Visionaries as we explore the power of purpose and how to bring it to the world through your message. This season of the League of Visionaries podcast is brought to you by Totally Morpheus, creators of the Egg 3 Leadership Assessment. It's fast, it's fun, it's free, and it points the way to your living leadership legacy. I think the best place to start wrapping up this season is just with a deep, heartfelt thank you to the people who make a podcast like this possible. You know, the goal of this podcast is really to spread a visionary message and to help people to understand how much their visionary message matters. Now, the guests on the show, of course, have a visionary message to share, and that's the reason why we interview them. But the real bottom line about this is to share with listeners and viewers like you the real message of this, and that is that you too have a visionary message. It matters, and that there are ways for you to share it. So I want to thank you for watching, for listening, for following, and subscribing if you haven't yet. And I look forward to another amazing season, bigger, better, and full of great stuff. But you'll hear more about that coming up soon. The second person who really made this season possible is Totally Morpheus, which has been our season sponsor. Now, Totally Morpheus sponsors the League of Visionaries podcast very simply by providing this grand and swanky studio where we record most of the episodes, as well as the equipment that makes it possible to create the League of Visionaries podcast. So to Totally Morpheus, I have to say a very, very big thank you for being our season sponsor on this very first season of the League of Visionaries podcast. And if you're wondering, what is Totally Morpheus? Well, the tagline for Totally Morpheus is, "This is not training, this is transformation." And Totally Morpheus is a provider of leadership development, or shall we call it transformation. It's led by conscious leadership expert and international keynote speaker Ian Hatton, who was the guest of our very first episode when he spoke on conscious leadership. So it's well worth checking out episode 1 of this series to find out more. If you're a leader, or if you lead leaders, or you're an aspiring leader and you want to help emerging leaders go where they need to go, Ian's your guy, and Totally Morpheus provides the ways to make it happen. In episode 2, I interviewed Kendra Friedland, the founder of Money Mind Financial Coaching and a financial coach who specializes in freelancers and solopreneurs. I can attest to the fact that Kendra's expertise can change the way you look at a small business's finances. So if you're a freelancer, or perhaps you are starting out your own business, talk to Kendra. You'll find her at Money Mine Financial Coaching. In episode 3, our guest was Chantal Bueta, a catalyst for change who helps career changers and career seekers to really find a purpose-driven life and career. Episode 5 featured Mariana van der Walt, the founder of Remotania Coaching and the New Zealand Institute for Rural Entrepreneurship. Mariana is an expert on online remoting and entrepreneurship and the ways that the possibilities for online remote work are changing the world of business as we know it. She's also a phenomenal online business coach, and you'll find her on LinkedIn and at remotaniaremoter.com. Our next guest was the multiple award-nominated podcast host, Aoife O'Brien. Aoife speaks on the topic of being happier at work in episode 6, and one of the best places to find Aoife is at the Happier at Work podcast. In episode 7, we spoke about Africa, on the cusp of an economic miracle, guided by producer and founder Yelang Prujinka. Yelang's insights on what is happening in Africa and what is possible on this continent will inspire you. And if you are in Africa, if you're investing in Africa, if you're interested in Africa, this episode is one that will change the way you see things. Find her in episode 7. Our guest in episode 9 was Renier Lombard, who spoke on building in public, a strategy for founders, especially startup founders seeking venture capital funding, and other entrepreneurs and leaders to really build a profile based on what is actually happening in their businesses. Renier specializes on doing this on various social platforms and particularly LinkedIn. So he's worth meeting on our 9th episode. For those who are seeking energy, health, and well-being, our expert on this was Sue Fuller-Good. Sue speaks to us in episode 10. When it comes to visionaries, one of the important things we look at is, of course, the future. That's where our vision is situated, isn't it? And if you've been wondering how to really make the most of this, build strong principles around your approach to the future, there is no friendlier introduction to it than with the future's alchemist, Charlotte Kemp. I was fortunate enough to have a chat with Charlotte in episode 11, and it was a great conversation. I've heard many futurists speak. Charlotte's approach is the one that I've found the most human, relatable, and workable, and I highly recommend giving this episode a listen. By the way, since we recorded this episode, Charlotte has been appointed as the president of the Global Speakers Federation, and she's well worth checking out. Then in episode 13, we spoke to tech speaker and recently published author Alex Pryor. Alex recently published her book, Risking Irrelevance: Why Businesses Can't Afford to Ignore Web3. And she spoke to us on emerging technologies in episode 13. When it comes to bringing out the best in people, especially employees, there's no better authority on this subject than David Sand, a pioneer in the field of employee incentives and an acknowledged leader. Also a great international speaker with a phenomenal track record. And David spoke to us on leadership and performance improvement in episode 15. Then in episode 16, I loved chatting with Kalnisha Singh, development economist and speaker on sustainable development and ESG. So, if sustainable development is your thing, or you're wondering about how to meet your ESG targets and really make them happen, Kalnisha is the one to listen to. You'll find her on episode 17. And those are our guests of this season. But now, before we look at what's waiting in the near future, I would like to explain or share why I have put this League of Visionaries podcasts on ice for a while and why I'm wrapping up season 1. Shortly after I recorded the last episode, and I had at the time been planning to continue with a weekly episode released every Thursday, an odd thing happened. First, all the people who were lined up to come in for interviews suddenly were unable to make it. And I was just wondering if I should get worried when something else happened. Around 12 years ago, my brother sustained a traumatic brain injury that left him with very, very limited movement in his legs, his arms, his hands, a severe problem with his memory and cognition, and a speech impairment that would essentially change his life. And when it changed his life, it changed mine as well. I had made the decision to shift my priorities from building an international career to being closer to home, and eventually even suspended all my personal career plans for 18 months to become a full-time caregiver to my brother. In that time, we were able to accomplish many great things, improving his flexibility, muscle mass, his coordination, his cognition, and his mood, which made a very, very big difference to his quality of life. But in the ensuing times, a number of other things happened, including very severe medical battles, legal battles surrounding his care and his therapy and his equipment and all the surrounding complications. It was a major, major shift in my world. I'd made this the middle of everything and hadn't quite been able to step back into my own life. And for a long time, I really felt like I was not a leading character in my own life. Starting YaziMedia and beginning to gradually build up towards having a real business was a great ambition, but it was something that I found very, very difficult to make a reality. However, the League of Visionaries podcast was a tremendous step in this direction. And by May, we'd already reached the 17th episode. And that was when I realized that my brother's health was deteriorating and that it was so severe that I would have to make some very serious decisions about how I would be approaching the business. And one of them was, in theory, to leave anything that's not essential on ice. But things escalated so quickly that I didn't even have the opportunity to record a final episode for the season before he reached what was essentially going to be his deathbed. And he passed away not long after the last episode went up. And although I'd been planning to alert people of the fact that I'd be on hiatus, there was simply no opportunity. Things got so hectic with all the practical arrangements, and as you can imagine, a lot of emotional consequences of saying goodbye to a family member who had spent many, many years suffering, having lost his independence to this brain injury. Max's death was in many ways a release. The way that I saw it was that Max is now free after many, many years of pain, suffering, and mourning his own independence, which he'd lost through this injury. And for me, there was a surrounding trauma of all the advantage that had been taken of his medical care, I think there were some tremendous excesses and abuses there. And then also there was a legal battle that was devastating for me financially, personally, emotionally. All this because people were basically taking advantage of the fact that as a disabled person with allocated funding, Max was a sitting duck. And I was actively punished for pointing this out to the person in control of his finances, who retaliated by ensuring that Max would be deprived of a great deal of his support. And this really wiped me out mentally, emotionally, spiritually, financially, locked into resolving the consequences of this very unscrupulous behavior. So, in saying goodbye to my brother, a lot of the trauma was surrounding this abuse that had taken place, of the way that people had taken advantage of Max and abused their power. And after dealing with that, only then did I start becoming aware of the different layers and layers and layers of grief that resulted. The mourning for my brother's independence once again, the mourning for his loss, and then the mourning for 12 years, a quarter of my life, that had gone to the project of supporting my family through this crisis. The long and the short of it is that the podcast went from maybe missing an episode to suddenly going quiet for several months. I'm not quite ready to begin with the next season yet, and there's a very exciting reason for that I'll share with you in a minute. But I did think it's time to wrap up this season by saying, or explaining, what it was that prompted me to put the podcast on a hold for a while. What came out of the whole experience of stepping away for a while and also dealing with my brother's death was a new clarity on the importance of a vision, of a message, of a visionary message, and also a new understanding of what my role is and why this experience that could be described as a tragedy was also vital to understanding my own visionary message. And I had a wonderful opportunity to deal with this when I was invited to speak at the Johannesburg Pecha event in August. And that was all about your visionary message and why it matters. And Max's death had allowed me to see my message in a whole new way. I talk more about this in the Pecha presentation, which I'm not going to include here, but I am going to share the link, and I'll share it on the screen in a moment together with its QR code, so that if you want to, you can always go and give that a watch. It is one of the best ways to explain exactly what the experience was that helped me to step away from this podcast, to see things in a new light, and also to really reevaluate my own work and my own visionary message. And I hope that that's something that's going to benefit the show and all its listeners. And now for the good stuff. In the ensuing time, a lot of things have happened, and although I had put many things on ice, one of the things I'd done before all this started going down was to apply as a media partner for the Professional Speakers Association of Southern Africa's Convention 2024. The Professional Speakers Association of Southern Africa, or the PSA-SA, is a remarkable organization that brings together speakers to develop their craft and to spread the word of what they do. And their annual convention is a true gem for any speaker and any expert wanting to move into the world of professional speaking. It was a big and a long shot, and I was incredibly flattered to find out that they have approved YaziMedia as a media partner for the PSA SA Convention 2024 with the theme Art and Science. And the great news is that as part of our media partnership, YaziMedia's second season of the League of Visionaries podcast will feature speakers who are speaking at the PSA SA Convention 2024. So I'm thrilled to be having those speakers as guests on the show in the next season of the League of Visionaries podcast. With that, I'm going to wrap up this episode. Thank you so much for being part of the League of Visionaries podcast. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time so you don't miss out when that second season launches. And in the meantime, why not take a look at the other speakers? If you've missed an episode of the podcast, let me know. And also, if there are topics or speakers that you want to recommend, let me know in the comments. I'd love to know more, and I always love to bring in extra speakers. Of course, for the second season, we'll be focusing on the PSA SA Convention 2024 speakers from around the world, and they are some real leaders. But it's never a bad thing to start working on the guest list for the season following that. So do let me know. With that, I'm going to wrap up this episode, and I'll see you in season 2. Watch this space. You've been listening to the League of Visionaries podcast by YaziMedia, proudly brought to you by Totally Morpheus. Subscribe to the League of Visionaries podcast here on your favorite podcasting platform, and follow YaziMedia on LinkedIn to find out more about how you can share your visionary message with the world. If you are a visionary, chances are you are also a leader. But what is your current leadership state? The way you are leading right now, your default setting, if you will. The EG3 Leadership Assessment helps you to understand the way you lead, your strengths, and your potential challenges as a leader. And most importantly, how to create your unique leadership legacy. It's fast, it's fun, it's free. It's the EG3 Leadership Assessment from Totally Morpheus. And when you take this assessment, you will get an instant report right away, pointing the way to your living leadership legacy. Find the EG3 Leadership Assessment now at totallymorpheus.com.